Every holiday season, the same thing happens. Families tense up, old arguments resurface, politics enters the room uninvited. Money, resentment, and obligations sit quietly at the table, waiting for dessert. And right on cue, the richest, most protected people in America show up to tell you how to handle it. They speak softly, they smile, they say they understand, they say they just want to help. Oprah Winfrey, Gayle King. Two voices that have become a moral authority, not because they ask better questions, but because no one is allowed to question them back. This is not a story about bad advice in the casual sense. This is a story about advice that never pays a price. Because when someone tells you to confront your family, cut off a relative, head off a marriage, or speak your truth at the dinner table, there is one question that never gets asked. What happens to them if it goes wrong? The answer is always the same: nothing. They do not lose family. They do not lose stability. They do not lose a safety net. Tonight, we are not asking whether Oprah and Gayle mean well. We are asking something far more uncomfortable. What happens when empathy becomes authority, when advice becomes control, and when the people least affected by consequences are the ones guiding your most fragile decisions? This is not a story about holidays. This is about power. To understand why this advice lands the way it does, we need to stop looking at Oprah and Gayle as two separate people. They are not. They operate as a single moral unit. Not because they agree occasionally, but because disagreement almost never survives long enough to matter. One speaks, the other affirms. A sentence begins on one side of the couch and ends on the other. What you are watching is not conversation, it is confirmation. Over time, that creates something powerful and dangerous, a closed moral circuit, an authority that appears warm, conversational, and open while quietly remaining unchallenged. This is why their advice feels settled before the question is even finished. There is no real uncertainty, no curiosity, no space for the possibility that the listener's reality might be structurally different from theirs. They do not ask, what happens if this goes wrong for you? They assume it will not, because in their world it rarely does. When Oprah and Gayle speak, they are not speaking as women navigating family conflict. They are speaking as people buffered from it. Their wealth insulates them. Their status protects them. Their access creates exits that most people do not have. They can leave the table. They can change the subject. They can disappear. That is the unspoken power beneath every gentle sentence. And this is where the imbalance begins. Because advice does not become authority when it is correct, it becomes authority when it is repeated without resistance, when it is delivered by people who never have to prove it works under pressure. The audience is not listening because Oprah and Gayle have lived this life. They are listening because Oprah and Gayle have survived everything else. That distinction matters because the moment advice is insulated from consequence, it stops being guidance, it becomes instruction. And instruction, when wrapped in empathy, feels less like control. But it still is. And once you see that, the question shifts. Not, is this advice good, but who gets to give advice without ever being wrong? That question takes us directly to the problem of consequences. This is where the advice begins to break down. Not because it is cruel, not because it is shouted, but because it is weightless. When Oprah and Gayle advise people to rotate holidays between families, confront relatives at the table, intervene in marriages, or speak hard truths during moments of tension, they are making a silent assumption that the cost of being wrong is manageable. For them, it is. If a holiday goes badly, they leave. If a family relationship fractures, they have others. If conflict escalates, their lives remain intact. But for the people asking these questions, there is no exit ramp. There is one family, one dinner table, one fragile balance holding everything together. This is the difference between advice that sounds brave and advice that is survivable. Because telling someone to just say how you feel is easy when you are not dependent on that relationship for childcare, emotional support, or financial stability. Telling someone to head off a marriage sounds empowering until you realize you are asking them to detonate a social structure they cannot replace. The problem is not that Oprah and Gayle do not care. The problem is that they do not calculate risk the same way. They cannot. Their lives are structured to absorb fallout. Most lives are not. And that is why advice from the top so often misfires at the bottom. It assumes flexibility where there is none. It assumes resilience where people are already stretched thin. This is why advice without consequences is the most dangerous kind. Because it encourages action without accountability. It frames disruption as growth. It treats emotional fallout as collateral damage instead of lived reality. And once again, the question shifts. Not why would someone ask Oprah for advice, but why do we trust advice from people who will never live with the outcome? That question becomes even sharper when the advice is delivered during the one time of year when consequences cannot be escaped. The holidays. And that is where the real stress test begins. Holidays are not just dates on a calendar. They're pressure chambers. They are the one moment when people who normally keep distance are forced into the same room at the same time with the same unresolved history. You cannot leave early without consequences. You cannot change the subject without being noticed. You cannot disappear without paying for it later. This is why holiday advice is different from advice given at any other time of year. It is not theoretical. It is not flexible. It is not optional. And this is precisely where celebrity advice fails. When Oprah and Gayle suggest speaking your truth at the table, confronting relatives, or setting firm boundaries in the middle of a holiday gathering, they treat the moment as a self-contained scene. Say the thing, feel the release, move on. But real families do not work like that. The holiday table is not an episode that ends when the credits roll. It is a node in a long chain of memory, obligation, and consequence. What you say at dinner echoes for years. It affects who calls you back, who helps you when things fall apart, who shows up when you need them. This is why people hesitate, not because they are weak, but because they understand something celebrity advice often ignores. They understand cost. Holidays magnify class differences because there is nowhere to hide them. The people giving advice can step away from discomfort. The people receiving it must live inside the aftermath. This is the quiet violence of well-meaning guidance. It encourages rupture without offering repair. It celebrates confrontation without accounting for fallout. And here is the crucial point. If someone cannot sit at your table, feel your tension, and stay for the consequences, they should not be directing the moment. Holidays expose the truth of advice because they remove escape routes. They force reality to answer back. And when that happens, one absence becomes impossible to ignore. The man who is never at the table, the partner who is always referenced but never present, that absence has a name, and it leads us directly to the center of this story. Every story has a center. Sometimes it is not a person who speaks. Sometimes it is the person who never does. In this story, that person is Stedman Graham. He is not absent because he is irrelevant. He is absent because his presence complicates the narrative. Stedman has been Oprah's partner for decades. He exists. He has always existed. And yet when advice about marriage, commitment, boundaries, and partnership is given, he is treated like a footnote. Mentioned, but never engaged. Referenced, but never centered. Known, but never allowed to matter. This is not an accident. Stedman represents something that does not fit the authority Oprah and Gayle project. He represents a life that did not follow the moral arc they now instruct others to follow. No marriage, no public reckoning, no visible cost. When Oprah speaks about commitment, she does so from a position that is uniquely insulated. She has partnership without the constraints most people navigate. She has permanence without shared vulnerability. And that is the problem. Because advice about marriage, sacrifice, and long-term negotiation carries weight only when the speaker has lived inside those compromises. Stedman's absence becomes symbolic. He is the reminder that this advice is not lived wisdom. It is curated perspective. Carefully framed, carefully edited. In any other context, decades-long partnership without marriage would demand explanation. Here, it is quietly normalized, while others are urged to confront, commit, and restructure their lives. That contradiction sits beneath every sentence. Powerful people do not erase others by force. They erase them by telling stories that no longer require their presence. Stedman is not missing because something happened to him. He is missing because the narrative works better without him. And once you notice that, the advice starts to sound different. Less like guidance and more like permission to control outcomes without accountability. Because the person who never has to show up for the consequences is always the safest one to listen to. And that realization brings us to the final transformation. The moment where empathy stops being kindness and becomes a tool. This is where the advice becomes hardest to question, because it is not delivered with force, it is delivered with empathy. Oprah and Gayle do not tell people what to do, they guide them gently. They nod, they affirm, they use language that feels safe. I understand, I've been there, I just want what's best for you. That tone matters. Because empathy lowers defenses, it creates trust, it makes the listener feel seen. And once someone feels seen, they stop interrogating the source. This is how authority softens itself. The advice sounds kind, but kindness is not the same as accuracy. Understanding is not the same as equivalence. Oprah and Gayle have not been where most people are, not in decades, not structurally, not emotionally. They have not had to stay at the table because leaving would collapse their support system. They have not had to tolerate silence because speaking would cost them everything. Yet empathy allows them to speak as if they have. This is not deception, it is something more subtle. It is substitution. Their emotional fluency replaces lived similarity, their confidence replaces shared risk, and because they speak with compassion, the gap disappears, at least on screen. But empathy, when detached from consequence, becomes persuasive power. It encourages trust without offering proof. It invites action without standing beside the fallout. This is why their advice feels so compelling and why it so often fails people afterward. It is not cruel advice, it is incomplete advice. And incomplete advice is dangerous because it rarely announces itself as such. This is the final shift. Once empathy becomes authority, disagreement feels rude, doubt feels ungrateful, resistance feels like personal failure. And that is when guidance stops being optional. It becomes instruction. Which brings us to the only question that actually matters. Not who is giving advice, but who should never be guiding your most fragile decisions. This is not a story about Oprah being wrong. It is a story about distance. Distance between advice and consequence. Distance between empathy and experience. Distance between power and accountability. When people like Oprah Winfrey and Gayle King give advice, it often sounds reasonable. It often sounds compassionate. Sometimes it even sounds wise. But wisdom is not measured by how good something sounds. It is measured by how well it survives reality. Advice should not come from those who can leave the room without consequence. It should not come from people whose lives are structured to absorb fallout that others cannot survive. If someone will not be there when the silence lasts for years, they should not be guiding the moment that creates it. If someone does not lose family, stability, or support when things go wrong, they should not be directing decisions that could cost you all three. This is the uncomfortable truth beneath celebrity advice. It is not malicious, it is not evil, but it is unearned. And that is why it must be questioned. Before you confront, before you cut off, before you speak your truth at the table, ask one simple question. What does this person lose if I listen to them? If the answer is nothing, then their confidence is not courage, it is insulation. And the most dangerous advice is not the advice that sounds cruel. It is the advice that sounds kind, comes from power, and never has to live with the consequences. That is not guidance. That is control.